G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. Today we've got Unparliamentary, our fortnightly show where we unpack federal politics with a federal political reporter, and today I'm joined by Paul Bongiorno. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Pleasure, Ebony.
I've just got a few housekeeping things before we kick off, but thank you so much for joining us today. We had over 1,000 people register, and we just love how interested you all are in this ongoing series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. You can register for Unparliamentary and other webinars and events from the Australia Institute at our website, australiainstitute.org.au. And if it's your first time using Zoom, you can put in questions for our panelists in the Q&A box underneath your Zoom window. You can also make comments and upvote other people's questions if you think they're good. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our website later today where you can send it to other people or catch up with it later if you have to step out. So this week, as I said, we're joined by Paul Bongiorno, columnist for the Saturday paper and the New Daily. He's a regular guest on the 7 a.m. podcast and a 40-year veteran of the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery. And Paul, it's been another massive fortnight in federal politics. I kind of want to go to some of the breaking news that we've seen in the last 24 to 48 hours and what's happening in Gaza and Rafah in particular. So we did see the International Court of Justice made a ruling asking Israel to desist from any kind of military operation, but that's not what we've seen, is it?
No, there was horrible news overnight that Israel had bombed an encampment, killing at least 45 people and severely injuring and burning others, men, women, and children. It's not at all clear whether this was the bombing that Israel yesterday described as a precision hit on Hamas leadership, or as the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu apparently has told his parliament that it was a tragic mistake and that they're looking into it. But all it does is feed into the shocking experience of Gaza, of the Palestinians, men, women, and children. And what the world, the longer this conflict goes on, the harder I think it is for Israel to justify the way in which it is waging this war. Interestingly, I was talking to a quite senior minister last week, and he is very supportive of Israel. But he was telling me that in a conversation with the Israeli ambassador, that he said, for Israel's sake, just in broad geopolitical terms, this conflict should end, and we need, that is, the world needs, let alone Israel and the Palestinians need a new government in Israel. So that's coming from a supporter of Israel, somebody whose default position isn't to demonize all Israelis, let alone all Jews.
Yeah, and this obviously has been quite difficult politically in Australia. We've seen, for example, Peter Dutton talking about Australia withdrawing from the International Court of Justice and likening the ruling and other elements of investigations that they've been doing and laying charges against leadership of Hamas and the Netanyahu government as being anti-Semitic, for example. And that's an accusation that we see thrown around a lot. How do you think this debate, are we still in that kind of narrow debate where people are fearful of speaking out, or are we seeing the worse this conflict gets, the more people feel comfortable?
Well, I think people have been afraid to speak out and to speak honestly and of being misrepresented as being bigoted. Now, anti-Semitism, the usual understanding of the word, could be explained by 1,000 years of European history of hatred of the Jews, of putting them in ghettos, of pogroms against them, which culminated in the Holocaust. That's anti-Semitism. criticising the Netanyahu government and the way in which it has responded to the terrorist attack of October 7, that's not anti-Semitism. Israel glories in the claim that it is a democratic state, and the nature of a democratic state is a contested polity. And in Israel, in the parliament itself, there are opponents of the Netanyahu government, just as we have in Australia opponents to the Albanese government. They sit on the other side of the house and they're called the opposition. This equating of any criticism at all of Israel with anti-Semitism is basically puerile in my view.
And very unproductive as well. We have seen, for example, the Labor Senator Fatima Payman talking about this issue. How big is this in within the Labor Party, the need to kind of speak up more? Is that why we've seen Penny Wong kind of intervening in a few situations in Australia, maybe going in a direction that we hadn't anticipated?
Well, there's no doubt that the government of Australia has adopted a very different approach to the opposition in Australia. And the government of Australia accepts that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and the International Court of Justice are there as instruments of global justice and peace, to serve global justice and peace. The ICC, of course, Australia joined it under the Howard government. And to see and hear the leader of the opposition and his acolytes attacking the ICC, while at the same time maintaining that they are champions of law and order, is confounding, to say the least. Now, when it comes to the West Australian Labor Senator Fatima Payman, well, she is, in fact, she's the only hijab wearing of the Member of Parliament. She's of Afghan heritage. They themselves were refugees. And she's clearly a Muslim. She is a backbencher, and therefore she does have the freedom of a backbencher to speak. I think it is quite interesting to see that while the Senate, in a vote 2 weeks ago, rejected the concept of from the river to the sea, that can be interpreted in various ways, but there is no doubt the main interpretation is seen through the prism of Hamas, and therefore Albanese, the government, and the opposition have rejected that formulation. It was interesting to see that Senator Payman didn't turn up to vote in that division in the Senate, which condemned the use of that term. And the government, unlike the opposition, while disagreeing with the Senator Payman, have not publicly come out against her, named her, or criticised her. One senior minister said, well, it's very difficult to do so. There is no doubt that her views are shared widely within the Labor Party and the Labor caucus in the broad. And there is also no doubt that the broader Australian public, I believe, is absolutely appalled by what's going on in Gaza, and can see that while October the 7th, with the 1,200 people killed, Jewish people killed, men, women, children, babies, was horrific, 7.5 months down the track, 36,000 men, women and children killed or being starved to death is just as horrific. And if you want to use a multiplier, it's 7 months worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that we've seen in all modern conflicts is people can see this on their social media feeds. They're getting kind of direct images and footage of what's happening on the ground. As much as people might try and conceal what's happening, it's very hard to turn away from.
It is. Ebony, I think we should also perhaps make a point or have a bit of a think about the attack on the ICC, particularly for equivalence, for saying that democratic Israel cannot be equivalent to terrorist Hamas. That's a real straw man argument. The ICC itself came out and said that what we're talking about here is not the status of the terrorist organization or of Israel, but their actions. And I think it's worthwhile quoting, if I can, Karim Khan. He said, if we do not, Karim Khan is the prosecutor for the ICC,
Yep.
quoting him, if we do not demonstrate our willingness to apply the law equally, we will be creating the conditions for the law's collapse. Either standards apply to all or they are not standards at all. And that's what I can't understand. I can't understand the debate about, whether Hamas is, a duly constituted state or not, whereas we actually know, and when we were reminded by WikiLeaks that two democratic states, namely Australia and the United States of America, were accused of war crimes in Afghanistan, and in fact, evidence has been, produced to substantiate that. So the fact that a nation is a state doesn't mean it never breaks the law or commits atrocities, against humanity.
Yeah, it's not exempt from the law any more than any other country
Indeed.
should be, certainly. So the next thing that I wanted to move on to is we've seen obviously that the housing crisis is acute right across the country, and it's quite politically difficult, shall we say. We know probably the things that we need to do to fix it. That doesn't make it a straightforward political thing to do. The government has been kind of very focused on this issue. The Greens, for example, are really pushing the case of renters. But in the wake of the budget, I was really interested in Peter Dutton's response as opposition leader, really kind of blaming immigration for the housing crisis and in many ways a whole host of other things. What's the politics behind that, Paul?
Yeah, well, you'd have to say the government's getting it in the nick from both sides, both the Greens on the left and Dutton on the right. However, I actually agree with Alan Kohler, who wrote a very good piece in the New Daily last week, I think it was, when he said that Peter Dutton announcing in his budget reply that he would dramatically cut the number of migrants coming to Australia or allowed to stay in Australia. Well, that is an immigration policy. It's not a housing policy. And the claim that Dutton made in that speech and has subsequently repeated that if we cut 45,000 immigrants a year, then we'll free up 40,000 homes. Now, Kohler, who's an economist, he says, well, he can't make head nor tail of that claim. It's as if every immigrant grabs a house. We know that that's not the case. The figures don't support that. One of Dutton's measures is to stop foreigners owning or buying houses. Well, the latest figures shows that I think foreigners bought about 1,000 houses of the 500,000 are up for grabs. You know what I mean?
It's not really going to get us out of a crisis.
Well, it's not getting us out of a crisis. And what it really demonstrates now, maybe before the election's held, anytime in the next 12 months, they may come up with some economic policies to somehow justify these claims. But in the short and immediate term, I think that what it does, it unmasks a quite cynical and dangerous political ploy by the opposition to press that button, the button of immigration that triggers prejudice and xenophobic sentiment. It's an exploitation of people who fear that others, especially newcomers, are getting in the way. They're congesting our roads. They're stopping us buying houses or getting somewhere to rent. And therefore we should kick them all out, or therefore we should dramatically cut the numbers. What that does is foster division. Apart from the absurdity just in macroeconomic terms, for example, one of the biggest money earners for Australia last year was what they call education exports, $50 billion. $50 billion. This is the way in which our universities have been told they have to survive, get foreign students in.
Yeah.
And now somehow
their funding has been cut.
that their
over many
funding's
years.
cut by Liberal and Labor governments. And this is to be your source of income. And by the way, these same people come and they spend a lot of money in the Australian economy. And they also provide skills and staffing. And we know that there is a bit of a divide, not a bit of a one, a real divide between the Liberals and the Nationals on this. The Nationals want to quarantine regional universities and migrant seasonal workers, from any cuts that Peter Dutton might embark on. Well, that's going to be fascinating.
Well, it's very hypocritical, isn't it? Like, we'll just section off these people that we need and throw the rest to the wolves. And, very cynical politics as well. As you said, appealing to kind of that base nature. And it's certainly one that we've seen the coalition trade in the past.
Yeah, we certainly have. I mean, the template with the 2001 election, when we began to demonize asylum seekers and equate them with terrorists. I think the syllogism at the time after 9/11 was all terrorists are Muslims, but not all Muslims are terrorists, which was very convenient. That was unstated, but that was what was the sentiment that was motivating a lot of the policy, equating therefore Australian security with the demonising and the singling out of one particular religious and racial group.
Yeah, and something that we've seen in particular Peter Dutton do with very specific groups, kind of talking about Lebanese migration, African gangs, and all of that scare campaign he was trying to talk about in Melbourne at the time. But I did kind of, the point here is it's much easier to blame migrants than it is to tackle negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, that benefits a very small number of Australians. It's just a kind of a much cruder, more vulgar approach than doing anything to actually fix the problem.
Well, I don't know what you saw, but Michael Pascoe wrote in the Saturday paper, I think it was last week, a very thoughtful piece of analysis about the housing crisis. And he points out that unlike the post-war governments of Labor and Menzies, basically, government stopped building social housing. They stopped building housing. And if you want to solve the housing crisis, governments have got to get back into the business of building affordable houses. And if I just might make an observation here, it is true we need a mix. We do need private capital. We do need people to invest in owning a second property and renting it out. All of that's good. One of the things that I think the Greens are playing a populist card here is rent freeze. Now, the point about it is a lot of people who do have investment properties, and there are clearly very rich exceptions to this, but they have to negatively gear. In other words, they go into debt to buy this property that will accrue in value, and they use their tenant to help pay off that property. Now, if we put a rent freeze on that therefore doesn't enable the mum or dad investor in their second property to pay off their debt, well, this will deter private investment in housing. I think, that's not the whole story, but I think that's one of the reasons why the state governments and the federal government don't see a rent freeze as a permanent solution to the issue that we've got.
Yeah, it's a good point. It doesn't resolve all of the issues, certainly in the long term, but I think part of why the Greens argument has been so powerful is because, it's not just mortgages going through the roof with interest rates, but rents have accompanied that, as you said, because people are trying to cover off on their mortgages.
Well, precisely. It's a vicious circle.
Absolutely. It's making it more unaffordable all around. The next thing I was going to ask about is, again, it feels like in the wake of the budget, we've heard a lot more from the opposition, and apparently in the next couple of weeks, we're going to get the details of the nuclear power plan from Peter Dutton. It was supposed to come out before the budget so we could see all the numbers. That didn't happen. But recently there were reports that they'll announce that in the next couple of weeks, including up to 7 potential sites where they might build this. Now, I did the ABC newspaper headlines last week, and we talked about this announcement that nuclear policy was on its way. I pointed out that it was amongst, if not the most expensive form of new energy to build, and people on Twitter went absolutely nuts about this. But this is really, I mean, there's no meat on the bones of this policy. We know that it is the most expensive. We're already in a cost of living crisis. What is motivating the coalition to go down this nuclear path?
Well, I mean, even the way in which you've framed this discussion now almost falls into the trap that Peter Dutton has set for all of us, namely that we can discuss nuclear as the answer to our energy problem and the transition from fossil to fossil fuels, that is higher emitting fuels, to zero emission with nuclear, as if we do it now, if we accept it now, we will get cheaper and firmer electricity. Well, let's prescind from the debate about its cost and whether we'd want to do that, whether we'd want to put billions of taxpayers' money into it when we should or could be doing it with batteries and hydro and the rest of it. Let's put that argument over there and say to Mr. Dutton, you keep citing things like how cheap power is in Ontario, which for the last 30 years has had nuclear power, or Europe, which since the war has had nuclear power. That's the Second World War, over 70 years ago now, as if we could click our fingers and suddenly we would get the same energy setup as Ontario in Canada. So the most optimistic prediction that you could see would be 20 years before we saw a nuclear plant. And then whether the power that it produces would be cheaper is back into the argument we just started. Well, the CSIRO says, no way, Jose.
Yeah.
So maybe voters are going to say to Mr. Dutton, look, I don't mind maybe nuclear in 2050, maybe, but what about now? What about what are we going to do? Nothing between now and 2040 or now and 2050? I mean, the planet is heating. We all need to get very serious about this. And the fact that, we're trying to work out the Liberals have been in power 20 of the last 30 years. If we don't have nuclear, what the hell have they been doing?
Exactly.
And what about our transition? They're now highly critical of the transition away from fossil fuels. And even then the availability of domestic gas. Well, what did you do for 20 years?
Yeah.
I mean, dragging the chain, waging the climate wars has left us in the predicament that we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see we've got close to 460 people on the line with us. Just a reminder, if you've got a question for Paul, you can type it into the Q&A box down the bottom. And you can also upvote other people's questions. That'll help me to pick the good ones to ask him about. Another thing I was interested in over the weekend, we saw a pretty big backlash against some comments from the ABC chief political correspondent, Laura Tingle. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that was about?
Yes, well, the backlash has been driven in a huge way by the Australian newspaper, which has obviously decided to target Tingle. She's the highest profile political reporter on the ABC, has enormous standing amongst her peers, and they've sent reporters along to the Melbourne Writers' Festival and then on the weekend to the Sydney Writers' Festival, and have taken great umbrage that she would dare criticise Peter Dutton and his stance on immigration, particularly a remark that she is reported in the Australian as saying that let's face this, we're a racist country and it's very distressing. And they're saying, well, how dare you? You know, I mean, and how can she possibly remain a reporter on the ABC when she has these jaundiced views? Now, mind you, if she agreed with their views, you know, they wouldn't, the pylon would rapidly disappear. But I sense here what's known as projection. The conservative cheer squad, particularly in the Murdoch media and the Australian, in trying to defend the opposition's homing in on immigration in the way that it has, because we should remember the Labor government is also going to reduce the numbers of migrants, but the way in which, as we've discussed before, the way in which Peter Dutton and the opposition are pursuing it looks and smells like pressing the racist button. That's all about. So they're projecting prejudice onto Tingle, you know, and in high outrage in the hope that no one will notice that the way in which they are pursuing the immigration argument is tainted.
And certainly they have in the past, particularly the Australian, picked individual Australians of colour and really done this kind of similar pylon for comments that they've made in places. So it's a playbook they return to often.
Yes.
And very concerning. And yeah, I mean, there's any number of things to show how Australia is still a very racist country. Well,
I saw the Shadow Minister David Common making the comment that, you know, all Australians are entitled to their own opinion, but you can't have a senior political journalist on the ABC showing bias. Well, bias is, as we were saying before, in the eye of the beholder. And is it bias? And this goes to the anti-Semitic debate. Is it bias to say that your activity has all the hallmarks of an atrocity? Oh, you can't say that, that's biased. Oh, well, let's have an argument about what we're seeing and why. You know, a good example of this going about bias is that the Australian opposition needed no prompting to cheer when Vladimir Putin was called a war criminal and Russia was condemned for its invasion of Ukraine. Well, what were they basing that on? What they saw with their eyes and heard with their ears on television news every night.
Yeah.
The same thing that we're getting now out of the Middle East.
We're going to go very shortly to questions from the audience, but I did just want to touch on before we left an announcement from the weekend about the National Consent Education Campaign. I think around $40 million for that. A few years ago, the government released a widely panned, I think it was called the milkshake ad about consent that was withdrawn within a week. This seems to have been much more well-researched, much more feedback and input from the sector itself. And it's much more geared at parents having conversations about consent with their children. And I thought it was a really interesting take that a lot of the advertising talks about the confusion that people have and the questions that they ask that I imagine would come out of focus groups and things like that. I think really to say to people, look, lots of people find this confusing. Lots of people, you know, need a bit of help to have this conversation. And the website that the government has created and the advertising campaigns are really trying to equip parents in particular with some practical resources, some conversation guides to kind of start these conversations so that it's not just happening in schools. That's another element that we've seen activists like Chanel Contos, who's worked in the past with the Australia Institute, and has an organisation called Teachers Consent that's really pushed for this to happen in schools. And obviously, Paul, part of a much bigger focus in recent months on women's safety, because we have seen such an increase in the number of women murdered by their intimate partners. How important is it that the government is doing this kind of advertising campaigns? And how much, you know, do we still have to go, I guess?
Yeah. Look, I think it's extremely important. It's good to note that it hasn't descended into petty partisan politics. all sides of politics realise that we have a crisis, that domestic violence is real, that women are victims, that we have a toxic misogyny, that we have to, in learning to mature away from a rampant patriarchy to a more inclusive society, people do need help. And it does seem to me that the current ads that I've seen are very sensitively done. They're aimed, as you say, directly at adults. And I would say this, that what we need in our society is loving couples modeling respect. And if they model respect for one another, and model that to their children, then we're going a long way to understand that real men don't, beat up women. That when we talk about equality, we mean equality, and we have to move away from things like, coercive control and all of that, which, by the way, are also, I think, complicated by the fact that, there are a lot of people with a lot of issues. They've, their mental health is real. Their sense of security or insecurity is real. The way in which they have struggled or are struggling with their identity, both sexually and otherwise. Am I worth anything? Who am I? All of this sort of stuff. It just doesn't come easily or by osmosis. You actually have to spend some time on it.
Yeah.
We do need, if you like, human education.
Absolutely.
And that's why this $40 million and the number of programs related to it, I think, will be money very well spent. I hope it will be anyway.
Yeah, and if people are interested in some of the more direct interventions that government could be making, you can check out our latest episode of our podcast, Follow the Money, where I talk to Jess Hill, an investigative reporter and researcher who has done a lot of research into coercive control in particular, but at the things besides shifting attitudes and shifting culture that we can be doing to hold men accountable for their behaviour and also change their behaviour, not just in the long term, but in the short term now, to protect women. That includes things like tackling the alcohol industry, the gambling industry, a lot of these things that we know can trigger episodes of violence between intimate partners, most often men's violence against women, but not always. So if you're interested in that, please do check that out. Paul has to leave us a little early today to get back to question time because Parliament is sitting. So I'm going to move to questions from the audience. The first one is from Richard Bentley, Paul. He says, as we approach the next federal election, we face the potential of minority government. And in terms of economic policies, we've got some idea of where the Greens stand, but not so much focus on Teals and independents. Should more effort be made to draw out their position collectively or independently? What do we know in the wake of the budget about the kinds of economic policies coming out from the crossbench?
Well, when we talk about the crossbench, on some issues they get together and they put out something, but independents are just that, independents, and every member of the crossbench would have to be asked, well, what do you think about this? We do know that Jackie Lambie and her colleague, who no longer is part of the party, I don't think, but anyway, they're still good mates, and and David Pocock speak out on issues. Pocock has been particularly articulate and has well-formed, thought-through views in the economic policy area, especially regarding housing and taxation. When it comes to some of the others, you've just got to go to their positions. I noticed that Zali Steggall is certainly not shy of putting what she thinks about anything out there, especially to her constituents, but more broadly, as does Allegra Spender, who's had a fair bit to say on tax reform. Kylie Tink is actually very outspoken also on refugee situation.
Yeah, I was going to say Monique Ryan
is particularly strong on a variety of issues and is certainly no... what is it? Shrinking petal?
Shrinking violet.
Shrinking violet. That's what I wanted. And not to be missed, of course, is the terrific work done by the Tasmanian Independent Wilkie, particularly in regard to war crimes and WikiLeaks, and of course Julian Assange, and we should have a shout out too for the teal over there in Western Australia.
Kate Cheney.
Oh, Kate Cheney, yeah, and she's made her position known on a number of issues, and I guess from that point of view, depending on where you live and what your electorate is, unless you've got a teal, to vote for, what they say or don't say will only have real cachet in their own electorates, whereby if you've got a political party like the Greens or the Labor or the Liberal or the Nats, their party position is pretty relevant to how you might vote for one of their candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really exciting for the opportunities it does open up for a conversation around tax reform. There's a lot more appetite from the crossbench, for example, for taxing the fossil fuel industry more fairly. Even someone like Allegra Spender, who's from a very wealthy electorate, has talked about, putting everything on the table in a conversation about tax reform. So I think there's some encouraging movement there.
Well, if the crossbench after the next election is generally as informed, intelligent and moderate, contemporary and inclusive as this crossbench has been, the country, I think, would be very well served.
The next question that we've got is building on, I guess, the housing point that you were making earlier. It's from Steve Artis, and he asks, on the huge increase in investment by the federal government, can you please talk about the risk of relying on private sector developers rather than state-based housing development services? We have seen the government kind of set up its Housing Australia Future Fund, which is not building the houses, but providing kind of the investment for it. There's, as you said, a lot of risks in that, in just outsourcing it. I mean, the private sector hasn't solved the housing crisis yet.
The private sector has also got problems with supply chains and builders, workers, Yes, well, the government boasts $32 billion for housing. It wants 1.2 million homes built in the next 10 years from July. And it put $6 billion more in the latest budget. Australia is a mixed economy. I think we've tilted too far private rather than public in these issues, and hopefully that's going to be addressed at the federal and state level, much in the way, as I was saying earlier, that the Menzies and Chifley governments addressed immediately post-war.
Yeah, Menzies in particular had he was very personally invested in making sure more Australians owned a home, because he thought that would make them better citizens and more invested in the democracy, and he thought it would make them more likely to vote Conservative. So
he's probably right about
political strategy behind it too. Another question is from Roger Tonkin, and he says, with Labor now accepting that gas will be required after 2050, can Labor still achieve the net zero emissions by 2050? And I think he's talking there about the future gas strategy that Labor recently released, but also with the coalition relying on, can the coalition achieve net zero by 2050 with nuclear?
Yeah, well, first of all, we've got to get nuclear. We've got to get the states to lift their bans on nuclear, and we've got to get the federal parliament to do so. Then we've got to get someone to invest and build. So
then you've got to get 7 cities to agree to have it.
Something like that, yeah. Look, don't forget, when we say net, we're not saying absolute zero. Net zero means there is a role for energy sources that create emissions. So now the government and Chris Bowen are pretty confident that, providing enormous roadblocks aren't put in the way between now and 2050, they can achieve those targets. In fact, they're quietly confident that they can overachieve. Now, anything could happen. We could have a change of government. We could unwind it all. Although it does obviously appear that even though the world is dragging the chain, worldwide action is being taken. You only have to look at what President Biden's done with his multi-billion-dollar, fund to hasten the transition away from, emitting energy sources.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been, I think that's how the government has positioned the Future Made in Australia policy as kind of a bit of Australia's answer to that Joe Biden policy. Obviously, it's dwarfed by the level of investment in the United States, but it is very disappointing, I think, to see Labor basically, backing in gas yet again. There wasn't really much in there about a path out of gas. It was more a pathway into gas in the future gas strategy.
I know that's the perception. Labor would argue that that gas is their pathway to hastening the the ambition of 80% renewables by 2030. You know, that the more renewables you have and the more stable their supply is, not only not by firing up gas, but by having a grid whereby if the wind's blowing in South Australia, we can get their electricity, or we can get the electricity across the Tasman from from Tasmania, or we have more hydro, I agree. Your sentiment is correct, completely correct. We need less reliance as the years go by on gas and on fossil fuel energy sources. Bowen and the government would argue that's what they're aiming at, but they are being realistic by saying that we will need some gas beyond 2050. By the way, they also put it in the context of continuing to supply South Korea, Japan, and others, India, as they too transition away. Look, the fact of the matter is the planet really needs absolute zero yesterday.
Yeah.
That's the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably time for maybe one or two last questions. The next one's from Patricia Farrar, who kind of makes the comment actually that our health system would collapse without immigration, pointing there towards obviously how much Australia relies on skilled migration, but also unskilled, as you were mentioning before. Are we yet to see this really play out, the actual consequences of if we did reduce immigration in a big way, as Peter Dutton is suggesting? That would have consequences for the economy in a huge number of sectors, would it not?
Well, absolutely. The Grattan Institute reckons that it would cost the economy $34 billion, in the coming years. On health, over 50% of our GPs are foreigners. We'd be absolutely stuffed without them, Absolutely. In fact, we need more of them, in that. And then nurses, care workers, particularly from the Philippines, but not only the Philippines, the South Pacific. We can't get enough of them either. And sure, we do need to train more of our own, and we need to pay all of them more.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah Brown here asks about Liberal pre-selection in New South Wales, and will this type of result be replicated in other states? I presume Sarah there is referring to the order on the Senate ticket with, is it Holly Hughes in New South Wales? Have you been looking?
Oh, well, what we know at the weekend, that Holly Hughes, who belongs to Scott Morrison's old faction, she was dropped down to an unwinnable position on the Senate ticket, but she was replaced by a member of the Conservative faction, a woman, in number 2. So the New South Wales Coalition Senate ticket will be 1, 2 Liberal, 3 National, and 4 Holly Hughes, which is generally considered as the unwinnable position. I don't know whether she's referring to whether addressing the imbalance between male and female candidates is the issue here, or the imbalance maybe between, moderates and Conservatives in New South Wales. The faction system in New South Wales for both the Liberal and the Labor Party is pretty Byzantine, and I'd have to spend a lot more time to be able to really dissect those entrails, I think.
The Australia Institute actually looked at the numbers not that long ago, and we found that the proportion of women in the coalition did go up after the last election, but that was only because so many blokes lost their seats.
Yes.
So not really because of conscious choices there.
Well, it was interesting that the Howard government, when it first came in '96, had an enormous influx of women because they won all those hard to win seats in the Howard landslide.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
Look, as I mentioned, Paul has to go a little bit early today because he's got to get back for question time. So I apologize. We're going to wrap up a little bit early today, but thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. If you are interested in how we solve the housing crisis, next week, next Tuesday, we'll be talking to Maya Zizi, the head of the Everybody's Home campaign. She's the national spokesperson. Purple Pingers, the creator of shitrentals.org, will also be on that panel, along with one of our economists, Matt Grudnoff, to talk about some of the tax reforms that would help solve the housing crisis. You can find those details on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. Thank you again, Paul Bongiorno. Thanks everyone for joining us, and hopefully we will see you all next week or next fortnight for the next Unparliamentary. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you all soon. Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.